A very good afternoon to all of you that have joined the conversation today. My name is Kathy Motlashana. I'm going to be your moderator, and these conversations, part of the aim are really to help us discuss and dissect some of the issues around local government. Of course, we've got a local government election that's literally 6 days away, and one can get the sense of that when you look at news reports, you read through newspapers, you drive down the road. Certainly a greater presence of political party, whether it's the banners, whether it's their activists or representatives on the ground, trying to convince South Africans to give them their vote. So this series of conversations has been brought to you in collaboration with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung Institute alongside the Mail and Guardian. And today it's a pleasure for me to welcome our guests who are going to be focusing on corruption and governance in local government. Reboni Tau is a program manager for political affairs at Rosa Luxemburg. Dr. Tracy Ledger is with the Public Affairs Research Institute, and Sumaya Hendricks is a dialogue and advocacy acting manager at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. So plenty of insights that our guests are going to be able to share on this issue of corruption and local government. Dr. Ledger, I'm perhaps going to begin with you. So what I'll do is that I'll give all of our panelists an opportunity to make their opening remarks. That will be for about 5 minutes each. I'm going to ask you just to watch the clock, please. And from there on, then we'll build on the conversation and allow people to make whatever points and questions that they may have for the panelists. Dr. Ledger, part of the reason why I wanted to start with you is because I can remember over a series of local government elections. I know you probably speak to a lot of journalists round about these cycles, but so you may not have the conversations we've had over the years, but I certainly do. And you've done a lot of in-depth work looking at what has really led to the destruction of local governance and what are some of the issues that we find many municipalities facing that ultimately result in, one, services not being provided, but in the escalation of corruption from a very, very basic level, including just how councillors are elected and end up on some of those candidate lists. So I'm going to give you the first opportunity to give us some of your opening remarks, and I'll do the same with the rest of our guests.
Thank you, Kathy, and good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I think if we want to contextualize governance and corruption, I think it's important for us to remember this very sort of obvious fact, which is that for the most people, the pressing issue in their municipality is the quality and reliability of the services that they get and the cost of those services. So we need to link issues around governance and corruption to the way in which they impact the delivery of those services and then the cost of those services to the average household. And I think in that context also it's useful for us to remember that more than 50% of South African households are classified as poor. The households, for a household of 4 people, 50% of them live on less than 5,000 Rand a month, and a quarter of all South African households live below the food poverty line. So I think that's the context there. So when we think about corruption and poor governance, we can think about corruption as a leakage from the system. It's everything that either makes those services more expensive or that in fact results in them not being delivered at all through poor contract management, contracts being given to people who can't deliver them. But a lot of the effect of that is through an increase in the cost base of a municipality, because the way in which municipalities operate in South Africa is that they're expected to raise most of their own revenue through selling electricity and water and sanitation to households. So the greater the cost base of the municipality, the more that households have to pay to support that cost base of the municipality, because the municipality can't have an unfunded budget. So that's the context in which we're looking at it. So, you know, the dominant narrative really in South Africa at the moment is that the only reason why we have poor service delivery or why people can't afford services, but particularly poor quality of services and reliability of services, is because of corruption. that really is the dominant narrative, that if we fix corruption, that we are then going to go and fix all of the problems in municipalities. And the general opinion is that corruption is totally out of control in local government. Every year when we see the Auditor-General's report, we see these huge figures for irregular expenditure, and we're like, okay, so hundreds of billions of rands are being wasted in local government in terms of corruption. And the point I'd like to make as a starting statement is that the situation is much more complex than that. And, you know, I often get accused of being an apologist for corruption, which I most certainly am not. But it is absolutely vital for us to correctly understand any problem we're trying to solve in order to have an appropriate solution. And the reality of the fact is that corruption is not the only problem that we have in local government. It's not the only reason why we have poor service delivery or unaffordable services. And when we see those figures in the annual Auditor-General's report for irregular expenditure, even the Auditor-General will say that in the vast majority of those cases, actually goods and services have been procured at a reasonable value. And the non-compliance with supply chain management is mostly very small. So we tend to focus on the big instances of corruption. And there's no doubt there are many municipalities in South Africa, and particular provinces are a problem, like Northwest, where in fact corruption is rife, and this has a very important impact, a negative impact on households' ability to afford services. But the reality of what is going wrong in local government is much more complex than just corruption. So it's necessary that we address corruption. It's necessary that we improve governance in municipalities, but that on its own is not going to address some of the bigger issues. So we find even in well-governed municipalities that have clean audits, we still have a situation where a significant percentage of households cannot afford to pay for goods and services, that the municipality doesn't have enough money to be able to do sufficient maintenance on its infrastructure. So I think I don't want to take up too much time. I just want to say that, you know, the challenge of what is going wrong in local government is much more complex than just corruption. And by insisting that the only problem is corruption and a lack of political will, we're doing ourselves an enormous disservice, because we're missing a lot of the structural problems that need to be addressed in order for all South Africans to have access to affordable and quality services. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Dr. Ledger. And I'm hoping that we'll have an opportunity to explore exactly what some of those structural limitations in local government are. Let me then invite Mayor Hendricks, who is with the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Earlier, I had mentioned that she is the Dialogue and Advocacy Acting Manager at the foundation. Sumaya?
Thank you so much, Kathy. And I think my planned remarks, I think, fit very well off the back end of what Dr. Tracy had to say. And what I really want to do is that, you know, the local government elections with the spotlight on local government gives us an opportunity to highlight issues around governance that are not necessarily commonplace, but yet affects the delivery of goods and services. And as a thought experiment, just as a background to the two issues I wanted to raise, is that I imagined a situation where municipalities had clean audits, where the Auditor-General was getting the kind of quality financial statements that she desires, you know, and that, you know, the financial skills were in place and so forth. And I imagined a situation where if that had to occur, does it necessarily mean that municipalities will be delivering on the full spectrum of, you know, from a service delivery perspective that they should be delivering on? And I think the answer is no. And I think what Dr. Tracy says is that is fundamental, is that, you know, corruption is not the only problem. And, you know, we mustn't, you know, speak about corruption in a way that neglects these other issues that we also need to be speaking about, and that the issue is a lot more complex. So getting to it, there's two issues I want to raise, and this is really off the back of the work that we've been doing at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. So one is really about roles and functions. So, you know, in order for, when we think about local government service delivery, we often think about water and electricity, but there's obviously a host of other services that local government need to be providing. Now, what is really important that we've seen in our work is that for there to be a clear understanding around roles and functions in the delivery of services. So what do I mean by that is that there needs to be a clear understanding about, in the delivery of this function, what is the role of national, province, and local government? And we've seen a big issue here because in the Constitution, there's Schedule 4B, which outlines the concurrent responsibilities with national, provincial, and local government. But unfortunately, the different functions mentioned in Schedule 4B are not properly outlined. And this is, and as just as a case study, there's the example of childcare facilities. So here you have a function that says local government needs to play a role in the delivery of childcare facilities. Unfortunately, this term hasn't been legally defined. We're not clear what it means. Does it only refer to ECD centers and creches, for instance? Does it include other facilities? What is meant by childcare? If facilities is mentioned, does that mean local government has a role in maintenance, in building the infrastructure, in regulation? Does it have a delivery, a function in all of those? And what it does is that when there isn't a clear understanding around roles and functions, like we see with childcare facilities, it creates gaps in the system. So you have municipalities saying, well, no, this is not really our responsibility because it hasn't been legislated. And then it becomes an opportunity for them to scapegoat on the particular functions. And it's really to the detriment of communities because they, especially in areas where there's a deficit of early childhood provisioning and communities are not getting the services that they need, which ultimately affects families and caregivers. And so you have a situation where nationally is saying, local, this is your responsibility. Locally saying, well, actually, legally, you cannot enforce that. So it's not necessarily our responsibility. So this lack of understanding of roles and responsibility is a big issue, especially in relation to 4B. We've seen it with other functions, for example, municipal health services, also mentioned in section 4B. And so that from a governance and a service delivery perspective, it's really integral. Without taking too much time, just quickly to speak about the second issue that we're really seeing that affects service delivery and just the functioning of local government as a whole is, which almost seems quite basic, but we've seen how this has manifested in so many different ways, is the misalignment in knowledge between local government and national government. So what you have is a situation where you have national departments who are sector leads in particular functions. So you have human settlements, that is the sector lead for housing, for instance. Department of Social Development is the sector lead for early childhood development. But these national departments don't necessarily have a good understanding of how local government works. Then you have local government where you have the opposite situation, where they have a really good understanding of local government, but not a really great understanding of the function. And this misalignment creates an issue because national government can't effectively guide local government in the delivery of the function because of the lack of understanding of local government and how it functions. And then you have a situation where local government can't deliver on the function because they don't necessarily understand the intricacies in the same way that national government does. And so while we speak about capacity building that needs to happen at local government, there's also a need for that capacity building to happen at national, so that national actually has an understanding of how local government functions. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
All right. Thanks for that, Sumaya. Let me also welcome Reboni Tau just to also weigh in on this part of the conversation and give the opening remarks. Reboni?
Thank you, Kathy, and good day to all the viewers and to the panel. I think I want to touch on something different from what the previous speakers have spoken about, looking at the councillors, that we have in this country, and also looking at the most recent report by SALGA, that you've got like over 66%, of councillors with no post-matric qualification, and also, which was, I think, a bit surprising and shocking, especially right now with the issue of COVID, that we've got 62% of municipal councillors who can't even use computers. So that is also a bit worrying, that how do they run their business on a day-to-day basis. So it shows that most of councillors that are deployed, and we know because of political patronage that happened within the parties, they lack professionalism, because if you look at some councillors, they've got no working experience. So that means that this is their first job. So they don't understand what is also expected from them as professionals, that they need to be ethical and so forth. And, government talks about Batupele principle, and I think a lot of councillors like that, putting the people first. It's all about making sure that they toe the party line, even at the expense of the people. We can see the example of Makana municipality, that even now we know that we're going to this local government elections, but there's a matter that is sitting at the Bloemfontein appeals court, where the Grahamstown High Court dissolved that municipality, but the provincial government decided to appeal with the municipality, the court judgment, And the other thing, which I agree with the latter speaker, what is the role of COGTA? Because all these municipalities are under COGTA, but we don't seem to be seeing really COGTA taking these municipalities to account, and to be transparent, because every time the AG's report will come and it will show how money is being mismanaged and how money is being misused. And it shows that even these councillors, they lack patriotism on their side, And the other thing is that let's also not look at councillors, civil servants who are employed at local government. Some are put there because of political connections, but not understanding, the role that they need to play in terms of service delivery in what is expected. Recently, we saw a letter from the public protector in the Northwest of one of the municipalities, and the people that were appointed without no skill, no experience, no qualification, which is a bit worrying, that people are taking, politicians are taking people for granted, putting people who are incompetent in such critical positions. Like there was one for water and sanitation, and the guy only has grade 11, which is a bit worrying. How is this guy going to deal with issues of water and sanitation without any experience and leading that portfolio as a director? I'll end there, Kathy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Raboni. And I think a number of the issues that you're raising are quite important, because they also bring us back to the kind of country we live in. So to what extent, should we be saying that this person is not qualified for this position, therefore they cannot hold it, when we know that our country has the kind of history where people were not able to fully access higher education. And, Dr. Leisure, perhaps this is a good point to bring you back in about just some of the systematic issues that lead to the kind of governance failures that we do face at a municipal level. Is it a case of not understanding roles and functions, as Sumaya was saying? Is it a case of having officials in these municipalities who are not adequately qualified, who do not have the kind of qualifications or experience to function fully in the jobs that they then ultimately end up holding?
I think it's a combination of all of these things. So certainly the powers and functions of local municipalities and the ability of them to deliver those powers and functions is certainly an issue. So, I think it's important for us to remember that local government doesn't exist for its own sake. It's not when the Constitution was put together that everyone thought, I tell you what, let's have 200 and something entities that can kind of run around and do whatever they like, and we'll give them some money, and they can have elections every 5 years, and there you go. And that seems like an extreme example, but sometimes it seems as if local municipalities act as if their existence is more important than what they're there to do. So I think we need to understand that the entire local government system exists for a purpose. And the purpose is to provide primarily, obviously in big metros, there are all sorts of other things that they do. But at the end of the day, the role of local government is to deliver its constitutional mandate. Those powers and functions that are set out in Schedule 4B of the Constitution that Sumaya was referring to. And there are obviously some that are more important than others. I think we could all agree that the delivery of water, for example, is more important than dog licensing, things like that. Okay, so we've got this institutional structure that exists for a purpose. And at some point, we have to say, okay, if it's not delivering what it's meant to be delivering, and I think we can all agree on that, even in municipalities where the quality and reliability of services is good, we still have a situation where people can't afford, people have to choose between putting food on the table and paying their municipal accounts. At some point, we have to say, okay, the system isn't working. Okay, and we can keep shouting at people in local government and making more rules and keep carrying on. At some point, we have to say, if the system doesn't deliver, we need a different system. We can't say, yes, the system will work if everybody behaves differently, because people are not behaving differently. There are obviously enormous problems with oversight and governance. There's this thing about when you look at the skills and qualification of people. There are Treasury regulations about the minimum qualifications for municipal managers and for chief financial officers. Not even half of municipalities comply. There are obviously serious problems. So the bottom line is, at some point we have to say, if the system isn't working, if so many municipalities say that they can't afford to get the skilled people that they need, well, then maybe there are too many municipalities and not enough skills to go around. Maybe the powers and definitely there's a problem with the powers and functions, but it comes down to the point that the existing structure, if it's not delivering, then perhaps it's time to say we need a different structure that will deliver. And I mean, my last comment is that, when we started off with a new form of the post-apartheid state, we were experimenting in all parts of the state. But most of that experimentation was in local government. We'd never had a system of local government that looked anything like this. So, of course, we had to invent things, we had to make assumptions. But now, 25 years later, is a good time to say, okay, if what we've got is not delivering what is required, maybe it's time to go back to the drawing board.
Dr. Ledger, you've taken this conversation in a completely, different direction, because the proposition that you're putting on the table means that while the scramble for resources that we're seeing at a local government level that exists, even with its intra-party or inter-party contestation, you're saying, well, let's, maybe find a different way that we approach local government. Rebone, is that something practically that you see us being able to do with the kind of governance structures that we have right now?
I think
you can weigh in a bit on that for me.
I think, as I said earlier on, because you can change the system, but if the people who have been put there are not patriotic, because it starts with that, understanding that you are there to serve the people first, before your interest, whoever who hired you from a particular party, So there also needs to be behavioral change, amongst civil servants, amongst politicians, I mean, we have seen recently, which one looks forward to seeing what's going to happen after the local government elections. We have seen that the ruling party has made its own councillors to sign a pledge last week or so. Will they comply to serve the people, or will we still continue to see the mess that we're seeing at local government? Because of the reality of the matter is that if there's no behavioral change amongst people to make sure that they are there not as politicians but as activists, who understand that the people of South Africa come first before their own interests, you can change any system, they will still undermine the system. So it's about behavioral change for individuals to understand that they are not there to serve their own interests but the people of this country.
Mm. Sumaya, weigh in on this issue of we need a new system. Let's not try to fix what has proven to be broken for 25 years. And just to the rest of our participants, of course, you can actively be part of this conversation. I am noting some of the comments that you've already posted in the chat group, and I will be also reading some of them out so that our guests today can reflect on what you have to say as well. Sumaya?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I'm with Dr. Tracy on this one. It is incredibly frustrating working with the different tiers of government and with local government, because I mean, one of the issues gets raised, which is very frustrating in forums, is that there is an autonomy, and I'm sure Dr. Tracy has encountered this. There's an autonomy and an arrogance around local government when they interact with national and provincial when it comes to their roles and functions, because there's a understanding that we as local government, this is our domain. We get to control what our bylaws are. We get to control what our fees are. National, maybe you can put frameworks in place, but this is very much our domain. So when Dr. Tracy speaks about local government existing for a purpose, and then in turn seeing what some of the behavior is like with local government when it comes to the implementation of regulations and such things, it is incredibly frustrating. And the thing is that while we do need people who are patriotic, unfortunately, being well-intentioned doesn't necessarily mean that you are good at your job. There's a lot of government officials who are so well-intentioned and, they have a good heart, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are effective at whatever it is that they need to, whether it's in the finance or transport or housing or whatever it is. So I think, I think it's important from a corruption perspective, but maybe from a governance and a delivery perspective, it's not necessarily the only thing that matters. But yeah, I think, look, the system is broken. I just half an hour before this, I was in a COGTA meeting about district development models, about the district development model and about integration of early childhood development in the models. And I mean, COGTA is trying, they're experimenting with DDMs, but, there's 3 pilot municipalities, Waterberg, Itaguini, and OR Tambo. I mean, how to get a program like that to scale, the buy-in of different people, it's really going to take a lot of time, and it's not clear whether that is the effective way to do it. But definitely we might have too many hands in the pot. I mean, when you think about the different tiers of government, the different people within the government, within the local space, the different, I was just thinking, for instance, the different finance units, do we even have enough auditors and accountants in South Africa? Really good. I was just from an Auditor-General perspective, is there even enough? Our universities even produce enough, which is really worrying. And just one more thing I want to add is that we have a situation where we need to think about the system as a whole, right? Not just local government in isolation. So if it is that we have too many hands in the pot and the tiers of government are not functioning, that's a problem. But then at the same time, we have a problem where there's a lack of officials and bodies and human capital at national and maybe at a provincial level as well that can't actually deliver on their function. So we talk about reining in the public service human capital. But we need to have that discussion while also talking about the tiers of government, because it might mean that we have people in the wrong places. So yeah, I definitely think the system needs an overhaul.
So talking about a system overhaul, Dr. Leja, could still put us a couple of years, if not around a decade out in terms of even perhaps getting there. So what do we do now? What do we do in the interim? Because South Africans are about to go to the elections on the 1st of November, and they would want to know what are some of the things that we need to be bearing in mind, that as we vote for different parties, we're also able to say, if we have a term where as citizens, we are holding officials a lot more accountable than perhaps what we have in the past, where would that begin and what does it effectively look like? So Mayor talks about the fact that there are too many hands in the pot. And that's the reality at provincial government and especially at local government. People are going as far as killing each other when it comes to this battle for these resources.
I think that there are 2 things that would make an enormous difference. Neither of them would take 10 years. In fact, one of them, the system is already in place. But both of those things are are in part beyond sort of the control of local government. But what is within the control of local government is that I think it's important for people to remember that the way in which the local government fiscal framework operates, the vast majority of revenue for a local municipality comes from services charges, property rates and taxes, and electricity and water charges. And we've done quite a lot of money on the affordability of services. And really, for the vast majority of households, services are unaffordable. The poorest households in South Africa are spending up to 15% of their income every month on a very small amount of electricity, less than they need, and up to 10% of their income just to pay for water. And one of the reasons for that is the total failure of the free basic services policies. So every year in the national budget, more than 10 million households are funded to receive the free basic services. It's the 50 kilowatt hours of electricity, 6 kilowatts of water, and basic sanitation. Only about 2 million households actually receive that. So immediately, if there was better oversight of the free basic services from national government, an extra 8 million households could immediately benefit from free basic services. And I think that people need to demand from their municipalities why they are not giving the free basic services to the number of households that are funded in each municipality. And that information is publicly available. It's quite easily accessible, municipality by municipality, on the National Treasury website, how many people. So that in itself would probably put somewhere between 30 to 40 billion rand back into the pockets of the poorest households in South Africa. So that's one thing we can do. The second thing that we can do is we need to remember that both the Constitution, Section 139 of the Constitution, and Section 63 of the Water Act actually give considerable authority to provincial government in terms of the Water Act, the Minister of Water and Sanitation, and in terms of Section 139, also to the National Executive to intervene in a municipality that is not performing properly. To date, the interventions have been done very badly. They haven't been done in line with what is required in the Constitution. Interventions in terms of Section 63 of the Water Act have been basically non-existent. So we have this excellent national framework that is designed precisely to prevent collapse in a municipality, but neither provincial nor national governments have been taking advantage of it. I know that there's been a review of the way in which these interventions are done, and the Deputy President is in charge of rolling that out. But that is something that people need to insist. You know, this thing that somehow that a collection of desperately poor households are supposed to, all on their own, make sure that their municipality behaves in a certain way, where national and provincial departments completely ignore their responsibilities in the system, I think is very wrong. Let me stop there.
Thanks for that, Dr. Leisure. It brings me to one of the comments Terence Aronsa has made in the chat box, and Terence is saying the lack of oversight by COGTA at local government level has resulted in poor governance at municipal level. Muzimkis is saying that should we have a hybrid approach, revamp the system, including a properly integrated government at national and provincial levels, whilst dealing with human soft issues, including corruption. Raboni, let me give you perhaps the opportunity to try and answer that question. A hybrid approach?
I would actually prefer to respond to Terence one.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah. I think I agree with Terence on this one, and that's what I said in the beginning, that what is the role of COGTA? And if we're to be honest, politics finds themselves, in this whole COGTA thing. I'll give you a typical example. The most recent in Gauteng, where the MEC of COGTA, Lebogang Maile, dissolved the council in Tshwane, and the DA went to court and they won the case. But it's just, you find that also politics are playing themselves in some of these roles where COGTA needs to be really decisive, in terms of oversight. And unfortunately, you have the ruling party ruling in most of the municipalities. And these people, by the way, in most cases who are mayors in these municipalities, are also chairpersons of their regional executive committees of the ANC in those areas. So it becomes a problem where there is no thin line to actually separate between politics and governance. Thanks.
It's such an important point that you're raising there, Raboni, because part of what I've found, we have this feature called Municipal Watch on SAFM, and we'll bring different stakeholders representing local municipalities. And oftentimes when the COCTA representatives come on, one gets the sense that in some areas, they feel they need to offer some level of protection for the mayor or whoever might be there to account. And then it raises the question, but how are you holding these people accountable when they're facing questions from their constituencies, you then try and step in to offer that, that cushion and try and prevent them from actually answering some of these questions. And the reality is that there is a lot more that can be done to stop municipalities from reaching the state of collapse that they do. So that these reports that are filed and these investigations that are held after the fact, sometimes it's actually all the time not good enough because you've been there the whole time. What were you doing? What was the oversight that was conducted? So this issue of COCTA is a really important one. And oftentimes, you find, again, those MECs are in the same committees, in the same structures of party organizations. And you could well find that, a certain mayor reports to that MEC in terms of how the party structures fall. And that also contributes to this lack of separation between state and party. So Mayor, I'm going to come to you and give you an opportunity also just to share some of your reflections in terms of where the conversations has gone. And then I think you're more than happy to try and answer Muzi's question around this hybrid approach and whether we should be dealing with the systematic issues and what he describes as some of the softer issues at the same time.
Thanks. Sorry, just a few remarks. I think what's made clear in this discussion, because we're talking about local government, but we're talking about COGTA, and then we're talking about the different tiers of government, is that, we can't talk about local government in isolation. And if you want to reform local government, we need to think about the system as a whole, which is where COGTA, I think discussions on COGTA really fit in. The way I see COGTA is, it's meant to be this glue, almost this mediator between, not necessarily the only thing that they do, but almost like a mediator between these national departments and local government, bringing together, from an IDP level, there's certain intergovernmental relations they're meant to be, fostering. There's certain things that from a capacity building, there's things that they do not do that they're meant to be doing when it comes to, capacitating local government officials and national officials in terms of their roles and functions. So I think there isn't clearly a clear understanding, and it's really interesting in national government, there isn't an understanding. I've had to explain this to people, the difference between SALGA and COGTA. It's really interesting that people generally do not, and I see Dr. Tracy smiling, I think she's mad, I've also encountered this, that don't necessarily understand the difference, because they're very different. One is a government department, one is an association. And so also having a clear understanding about the role of SALGA is important to understand, this is where COGTA's, functions end and start, and this is what SALGA can do so that they work in harmony. And it's really important because SALGA and COGTA have a huge amount of clout when it comes to local municipalities, at least in our experience, more so than some of the national departments. Sometimes the national departments, almost need SALGA and COGTA to kind of, speak to municipalities on their behalf because of their level of influence. So it's really important that, we're thinking about how do we strengthen local government, but then also thinking about these other role players like COGTA and SALGA, for instance, that can help, strengthen local government. In terms of the hybrid, I'm not too sure if I understand the question, but the question seemed to be alluding to the fact that we need to talk about these multiple issues at once. I'm not sure if I misheard, the softer issues. I don't think I wouldn't say corruption is a soft issue. I think it's quite a serious issue. And the problem with corruption, I know I haven't been speaking about it, but I heard a provincial official say that their worry is to where corruption becomes endemic, systemic, and syndicated. because then it becomes so part of the system that it almost doesn't matter if you change officials, because it'll almost be ingrained within the system itself, that there's almost like, gangs operating, different factions, and it's so ingrained in the institution that, if the 4 of us were on a panel and we were corrupt, if you had to replace it with another 4, for instance, it wouldn't matter because it's so entrenched in the system. And that was their worry. And that is like significantly worrying, because it is a leakage out of the system that ultimately affect the poor. So I'm not sure if I answered your latter question, but yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
All right. Thanks for that, Sumaya. And I think in some provinces, one could well argue that that is exactly where we are with the state of corruption, that it has become endemic, that it hasn't mattered that you've put different people in government. We've seen councils dissolved and new people coming in, and the same problems existing, if not being exacerbated. So one questions the extent to which, if we're not actually already there. Dr. Ledger?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a lot of corruption that is entrenched in the system, and that reflects factional politics, that reflects local disputes over resource allocation, that reflects all sorts of things, and that in fact a certain way of doing things has then become very much the way of doing things. If you think about the way in which a municipality operates and the day-to-day activities of a municipality, if people have been doing things in a certain way over the last 20 years, then that is the way that things get done in that municipality. And there are many places that we've been and done research, and national and even provincial government seems very, very far away from these places. They really do operate according to their own local rules. And once again, it takes us back to the point that it's very much people at a national level, and commentators like to say, oh, communities must hold their municipalities to account. But, you've really got to think about what agency do local communities really have in this respect, when basically everything that they need, apart perhaps from a social grant, comes from that local municipality, and that, that municipality is the only source of resources, employment opportunities, work opportunities in a municipality. So I think it's very disingenuous of national and provincial government to say that local communities must somehow, create a different system when they themselves are neglecting their own constitutional responsibilities. I know that local municipalities sometimes like to say that they're autonomous and independent. Nowhere in the Constitution or the Intergovernmental Relations Framework Act does it say that local municipalities are either autonomous or independent. We have an interconnected government that is supposed to work in a cooperative manner for one goal and one goal only, and that is to deliver the constitutional rights of the people who live in that municipality. And it comes down to things. I mean, Section 27 of the municipality talks about the constitutional right to sufficient water. Last time I read that section, it didn't say everyone's got the right to sufficient water, unless your municipality really doesn't feel like doing it, in which case you don't. So I think that it's once again, it's coming back to basics. What is the municipality supposed to be doing, and who is responsible for making them do it? And I think in that respect, national and provincial spheres have neglected their obligations and their responsibilities to the people who live in municipalities, and just gone, oh, well, those communities must hold the municipality accountable, which is really just a way of getting out of your own responsibilities.
Mm-hmm. Do you foresee that this move, given the amount of attention that local government now gets, and some of the studies that Ravona was referencing earlier about the need to have better capacitated people occupying, especially some of your senior positions, do you think that is going to have a difference at all, Dr. Ledger, in terms of the layout and how things are done in municipalities, especially if we still have politics and strong men and women somewhere behind the scenes that by and large seem to be pulling the strings?
Well, yes and no. I used to be an economist, so I can answer both things at the same time. I think that certainly there is strong evidence that shows that the better the kind of quality of especially the senior management in a municipality, the better outcomes you get. But that is also driven by politics. Good, competent, skilled people do not want to go and work in a municipality that is a hotbed of political problems. You know, I've been to municipalities where you'll have a very competent chief financial officer, but their family lives 200 kilometers away because they're worried that people are going to try and kill them. You know, so you have to address both things at the same time. And at the end of the day, the kind of issue that we haven't really touched on in this discussion is about the fact that because of the way in which the local government fiscal framework is structured, all the costs of local government have to be paid for by someone. And most of those costs have to be paid by the people who live in the municipality. So it's very difficult in a small municipality that's got an overwhelming percentage of poor households to say, okay, let's just get a vast number of extremely highly skilled and competent people. Somebody's got to pay for them. And it's the poorest households in the municipality that have to pay for them. So, you know, on the one hand, you have to say, yes, you can fill the municipality with lots of competent people, but who's going to pay for it? And we've already got a situation where people can't afford to pay for their services because of the cost recovery model, which is one of the other things we need to have a look at. But yeah, let me stop there.
Raboni, let me come to you, and you know, there's a question or a comment here from Jonathan Ross, who says that my focus of attention is land use and development corruption. It is entirely foreseeable that this domain would invite problems, but I cannot get the City of Cape Town to provide any studies, audits, or even responses to substantive questions on how they apply bylaws. And that again has become a big issue in various municipalities. We especially saw it under the lockdown, right? Of how local government was choosing to apply bylaws, let's say with a basic issue like street vendors and the extent to which they were allowed to continue trading versus not allowed to continue trading, even when government had given the green light for that to happen. That message somehow did not filter from national to local government. Raboni, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, okay. Just to agree with you, with the problem that we have is that, and I think one of the speakers said, where local government at times, when it suits them, they want to do things according to them. And I'll give you an example, just what you just said about the bylaws. And if you remember, there was a time even the City of Cape Town, on the issue of COVID regulations, they did not want to comply. You know, when cigarettes were being banned by national government and alcohol, and they wanted to have their own protocols in terms of how to deal with COVID. So that's the other thing that sometimes you find, especially in a situation where it's not a municipality that is run by the ANC, but run by a different political party. They will also want to do their things according to them. So those are some of the things that there is no proper cohesion in terms of doing things outside of different politics, but to say that there's different spheres, whether national government, and work together. That is the other challenge, that sometimes another municipality is governed by a different political party, so the relations are not good with national at times.
So, Mayor, I want to go back to the issue that Dr. Ledger had raised, and this was about the issue of accountability and the extent to which often communities are told, well, you know, this is happening in your area because you are not holding these councillors enough. And yet we know that oftentimes these councils, you have party representatives and not community members. Some of the meetings that are supposed to involve with this issues such as contributions on the IDP, etc. Some of those meetings are held in towns, in town halls, where the majority of people don't even know that they're happening, don't even have access to. So to what extent can we then genuinely say that the voices of ordinary people are included ultimately in what the citizens, the local citizens of an area want, or what they have to say about their services?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that there's a tremendous amount of responsibility and obligation that we we place on people in need and who live in informal settlements and rural areas. We, as I said, we want them to participate in all these processes. But it's not a simplistic thing to be able to, let's, for example, speak about IDP processes. We've had engagement with IDP managers, and it's not straightforward in the sense that, one, even if you did have incredible, participation from communities, we've had engagement with some IDP managers that say blatantly, even if we have communities coming in and saying that they want X, we've already decided beforehand that we're not going to do X, Y, Z. So we just referred it to the respective national and provincial governments for that particular sector, but depending on who the sector lead is for that particular function. So, you have a situation where, we put this burden on people to participate in these processes, but to what extent are some of these processes already have a predetermined outcome? And there's something I want to say about just Jonathan Ross's comment, which is that there's, regulations in place, but there's almost something deeper that he's speaking to, which is almost having like a pro-poor approach. And you see this speaking about, the new mayor, for an example, was speaking about the new asked about the inner city, and we're speaking about bylaw enforcement in the inner city. And this kind of language that people use about cleaning up, which is obviously very problematic, because when you're talking about people and people in need and poor people, and you speak using these kind of descriptions, but you have to balance. The mayor, the premier is always, and if you watch the Twitter account, they'll be like, they're enforcing bylaws in a city. And what does that enforcement of bylaws mean? It means getting rid of informal traders. And how do we create a balance between these things? Land use, we have huge issues of bylaws enforcement, because people want to enforce bylaws in areas where it's clearly not designed. It's designed for Sandton or Houghton, not for for Orange Farm or Deep Sloot. So there's something else that speaks about the orientation and the mentality of officials, which is it's beyond legislation and all these other mechanisms. It's like, what is their orientation what is the orientation such that when they read something, they interpret it in a pro-poor approach, which I think is also really important. Thanks.
Terence saying there in the chat group, how do we teach citizens the power of the vote in order to hold councillors accountable? And I'll come back to you, Dr. Leisure. We've seen a lot of research being conducted recently on, how are South Africans feeling about the elections? Are people going to be going out to vote? What is the level of trust in public institutions and government? And by and large, it doesn't paint a good picture in terms of where we stand. So if there's this great loss of trust in local government, in government as a whole, and that also finds expression in local government, what does that do for the legitimacy overall of something like a local government election? And when Terence talks about teaching citizens the power of the vote, is it that people don't understand that their vote is powerful, or are they choosing to make these decisions, even if it is a decision not to vote, because they simply feel excluded from the process, so that regardless of their vote, regardless of who they vote for, the system that they would like to be broken of corruption, that could well stay in place?
Yeah, I think there is a general breakdown of trust in local government. And I mean, you just have to look at things like GCRO's quality of life surveys and things like that to see that there is a breakdown of trust in local governments. And I think that is then reflected in a breakdown of trust in the state in general, because the average person in a municipality doesn't necessarily see the state as three separate spheres. They see the state as one entity, and that's mostly reflecting what they see at local government. For the majority of South Africans, the majority of things that they get from the state come from local government. So, I think that's really important, because by continuing with this deeply dysfunctional local government system, we are in fact undermining citizens' views of the state. And I think it goes back to the fact, I'm not surprised that people are disenchanted with the system. I think reflecting on what Sumaya was said, local government in particular is fundamentally anti-poor in its insistence that people must sacrifice food in order to pay for their municipal accounts, no consideration whatsoever of the ability of households to actually afford services, no interest that I can see in making sure that free basic services actually reach households, no interest in ensuring that bylaws and land use systems are actually going to promote the poor. So I'm not surprised that people are deeply disenchanted with local government. But what it does then is it creates a general sense of distrust with the overall state, because local government is the state for many South Africans. So it's a deeply undesirable situation.
Mm. So if we were to reimagine the future and what future possibilities might be, Rebone, what potentially can local government look like?
What a question, Kathy.
I know it's a difficult question, but this conversation has led us to that point where ultimately what is working, as Dr. Leje is saying, is dysfunctional. We need to rethink the whole system. But what would a different system look like? It would be good to have that as a working basis.
I think, to be honest with you, Kathy, personally, I've not looked at it from a different system, because the problem sometimes, and I want to bring something which I know is out of this topic, looking at basic education. We've changed the curriculum so many times. Sometimes you don't have to change the system. You need to look at what is not working in the system and work on changing what is not working. Unlike every time when something's not working, then we want to change something completely, and then it will take us another 20 years and say, oh, no, it's not working. Let's look for another system. So I think with what we have now, right now, we can actually have a thorough analysis, to look at what is not working and how do we then improve and change the things that are not working for us, unlike changing a system that we're not sure that if it will work, because we'll just be experimenting, and saying, okay, let's look at this system, let's look at that system. And at the end of the day, time is going, but the services that are needed at this present moment for the people are not being implemented or given to the people.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, Rebone, but I want to go back to this comment again that was made earlier. And Dr. Leje said local government is fundamentally anti-poor. So you think about some of the poor local municipalities in this country that rely on grants to be able to make any additional changes, whether to infrastructure, whatever, and by and large don't have residents who can contribute to the kind of revenue that is needed to go back into the system, get better administrators, get to a point where it's fully functional. So when you look at a municipality like that, even if everything worked perfectly, they would still be relying on those government grants to help build better road 10, 15 years down the line. And that for me is incredibly problematic, because it says that the nature of the inequality that we have in our country will fundamentally stay the same. It will remain what it is, that those households that are poor are still their grandchildren are still going to be poor, if we're not doing anything to say maybe how we approach this, how much resources we're putting into these communities should change. And perhaps the only way to change it is by changing the system.
But again, I think, Kathy, living in an urban area, and we look at, and especially look at the rural municipalities, that's where a lot of wrong things are happening in those municipalities. And this is where I think personally, the Department of Rural Development needs to come. The government has been talking about this, transforming the rural development, making sure that people don't leave also their rural areas to come to the urban areas to look for better opportunities, because then also that congests the urban areas, because then you find that the city planners have planned for such a number of people within that municipality in the urban areas, but due to every year people are coming to the urban area, but there needs to also be focus on rural development, in making sure that they transform and make sure that they build better cities also at rural development. And if you don't have also the Department of Rural Development working very closely with those municipalities, then you will not deal with some of these problems.
Okay. Alan Wills says there, he says a radical move would be to depoliticize municipal government completely and vote in competent councillors whose political affiliations are irrelevant and who are in favor of those in their constituency above any political agenda. So that's the view there of Alan Wills. Sumaya, let me also give you an opportunity just to weigh in on some of the issues that have come up. You can also talk about, based on the experience that you've had, is it really possible to divorce local government from politics right now?
Do you know, the thing is at least in my mind, I mean, it's not something I've thought about deeply, but when you are voting for a particular political party, you are voting for a particular orientation. And, I'm not speaking to any political party here, but I'm just giving an anecdote. So one of the things I'm also responsible for is land at the foundation. And we've been going on a big consultation process, consulting with land organizations in Gauteng, try to building to see the extent to which we can kind of build up, capacity and what role we can play in the urban land agenda. And one of the interesting things, someone had said they are part of a particular movement within inner city, is that they were speaking to the differences between the DA and the ANC, and they were saying that under the ANC, they live in an occupied building, and they were saying that under the ANC it was better because when the DA came to power, they cut our water and electricity. They cut our services. Now, there's different ways of looking at that, right? So from that person's standpoint, it was better for them personally under an ANC government because the DA wanted to, when Herman Mashaba came in, he was quite strong around social housing in inner city and occupied buildings, and so the services were cut if people weren't paying for it. So it was personally bad for that particular individual. But from his government, but from obviously from a government perspective, there are people in buildings that are getting services that they are not paying for, and so there's again a leakage in the system, and people are not, they're getting things that they're not getting paid for, and so it's an inefficiency in the system, and so there's kind of a different in perspective, and so the reason why I want to say that is that because as voters, when we vote, we have a particular person in mind, right? So when I vote, I don't necessarily think about myself when I'm voting, especially in local government elections, because I'm personally I feel quite far from local government versus being, I feel closer to province and national because of, service delivery. And we often find in our work that if you're an informal settlement, if you live in an unproclaimed area, you know what ward you're in, you know who your councillor is, you know who your previous councillor is, you know where your councillor lives. But I mean, I couldn't be, for instance, tell you where my councillor lives, let alone what ward I live in. And so the reason why I want to raise that is that because around orientation, when we vote, who do we think about? Who do we have in mind? Do we have in mind that person that's in inner city, in that occupied building? Or do we have in mind, thinking about the local government system as a whole and wanting to raise revenue for the state and services? So just an anecdote to think about. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Sumaya. And I know that you've also got a dash soon to another appointment. So I'm going to give each of our guests then an opportunity just to give us the closing remarks. Sumaya, let me begin with you because I know that you've also got to run.
No, thank you so much. I think this discussion was incredibly useful because I think we touched on so many things related to local government that we often do not speak about. And I think it was an incredibly rich discussion. I think that, we need to be open to experimenting. We often say we're a new democracy and a new dispensation. And with the newness must become also like a braveness with wanting to try different things, because in the reality, in the long term, while we might make a change that takes 10 years, we don't want a situation where 50 years down the line we're having the same discussion because we weren't brave enough at this point now to make the change. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks so much to the panelists and Kathy for moderating.
All right, Sumaya, thank you so much for those comments. Raboni, let me come to you also just to wrap it up.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. Thanks to Million Guardian for hosting this webinar. And yeah, I think first and foremost, which most people or South Africans are not aware of, there's also what we call ward committee members, and communities are not even aware of this committee that takes place. They're elected, and political parties keep this to themselves because of, by the way, when you're a ward committee member, you get a stipend every month from the municipality. So this is where also a space where community members need to make sure that they participate in this ward committee election so that they can bring the councillors accountable, because the councillors interact with ward committee members now and then, and the ward committee members are the ones who can also report to the municipality in terms of issues of service delivery. When there's a pothole, the lights are not working, street lights are not working in a particular area. So communities must also occupy that space and become ward committee members. And the other, lastly, is the issue of whistleblowers. I'll give an example. There's a guy, Cindy Somakaka, who was killed a few years in KZN, and it is alleged that he was exposing corruption that was happening in Mzimkhulu municipality. These are some of the things that the government, needs to really protect civil whistleblowers, because for us to advance any progress in society, whistleblowers needs to be protected, because people will not want to speak out if their lives are at risk. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Raboni. Dr. Ledger, you'll have the final word here.
I'm sure you'll have the final word, Kathy. So just thanks so much for the invitation, and I've really enjoyed the discussion. And just to echo what Sumaya was saying, we shouldn't shy away from radical change and difficult decisions just because it seems hard. We cannot be sitting here in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, or 30 years' time talking about the same things and still fiddling around at the margins. I mean, we're rearranging the deck chairs when we need a new ship. And I think that the starting point for that is to go back to real basics. And the real basics are the constitutional rights of people who live in municipalities. Their constitutional rights to quality, reliable, and affordable services. And that is the only basis on which we should judge what we're doing. And so far we're doing extremely badly, especially on the affordable services. And at some point we have to say that the system that is designed to deliver those services is not working. And how can we improve the system with that goal in mind? And that should be the only thing that we are focusing on. So thanks again, and thanks to everyone else who was on the panel.
Thank you so much to all of our three guests today, Sumaya Hendricks, Raboni Tao, and Dr. Tracy Leisure. Thank you also to the participants that have been part of this chat. Terence, you have been really active in the chat group, so thanks a lot for that participation as well. Remember that the Mail and Guardian is going to continue hosting these dialogues, especially as we edge closer towards the election. I believe the next one will be held next week, Monday as well. So by then, that will be voting day. Hey, next week, Monday, 1st of November. So please make time after you've gone to vote to come and join us to be part of this discussion. For now, though, we'll leave it there for today. Thank you all for joining the conversation.
Thank you.